In the heart of the beautiful city of Simba Kingdom, where the land sparkled with diamonds, life was perfect. The sun always shone brightly, the rivers flowed smoothly, and the fields were green and full of fruit. The people were happy and prosperous. There was no hunger, no poverty, just peace and laughter in every corner of the kingdom. At the center of this magical land was the royal palace, where King Marcus and his beloved Queen Liana lived. King Marcus was not only the wealthiest man in the kingdom but also the wisest. He ruled with kindness and fairness, and the people adored him. His queen Liana was just as loved. She was gentle and beautiful, and her smile brought joy to all who saw her. The entire kingdom rejoiced when news spread that the king and queen were expecting their third child. After 2 beautiful daughters, they were now going to have a son. The king's heart swelled with pride. Prince, an heir to the throne. From the day the news came, the palace buzzed with excitement. Workers prepared the nursery, painting it with gold and blue colors. The streets were filled with cheerful songs and markets boomed with celebrations. Every household had enough food and families danced in the streets at night. The kingdom seemed to shine brighter than ever. Finally, the long-awaited day arrived. Queen Liana gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. The palace walls echoed with sounds of joy and music. People filled the streets waving flags and cheering, "Long live the prince! Long live the kingdom!" The king held his newborn son in his arms. The baby's eyes were bright, and his little hands curled tightly around his father's finger. King Marcus whispered softly, "You will be a great prince, my son. You will bring honor to our family and protect this kingdom." But as the queen lovingly lifted the baby to kiss him, her eyes caught something strange, something chilling. On the back of the baby's soft neck was a red, round mark. It was as clear as the sun and impossible to ignore. Queen Liana's heart skipped a beat. "My king," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look at this." The king frowned as he saw the mark. It looked like nothing they had ever seen before. It was not a scratch or a birthmark. It looked unnatural, almost magical. A cold shiver ran through the king's spine, though he said nothing. The queen's face was pale. What could this mean? Is it a sign? King Marcus tried to calm her. "It is only a mark, my queen. Do not let it trouble you." But deep inside he too felt uneasy. The mark did not look ordinary, and a strange fear settled in his heart. As days passed, the whispers grew louder, and soon the entire palace was filled with rumors. Some servants claimed that they had seen marks like this in ancient stories, marks that brought destruction. The king could not ignore it any longer. He had to find out the truth. The king summoned the royal seer, a wise old woman named Lysandra. She arrived that evening, cloaked in gray robes, carrying a staff adorned with seashells and pearls. She looked at the baby for a long time, her ancient eyes glinting with curiosity and concern. Finally Lysandra spoke. "This child bears the mark of tides. It is a sign of great power and destiny. He will bring either salvation or ruin to your kingdom." Her words fell like thunder. The queen gasped, clutching her baby tighter. The king's face grew pale. "Salvation or ruin?" King Alaric repeated, his voice trembling. "How can we know which?" The seer shook her head. "His path is unknown, my king. The mark binds him to the will of the sea. If he learns to wield his power with wisdom, he will be a protector. But if darkness takes hold, he will bring destruction." Fear spread through the castle like wildfire. The court whispered in hushed tones. Some feared the sea gods would punish the kingdom for harboring such a child. Others believed the prince was a gift, sent to protect them from unseen dangers. The queen wept in her chambers, torn between her love for her son and the ominous prophecy. The king, burdened by the weight of his crown, paced endlessly. "What should we do, my queen? What if the seer is right?" The whispers grew louder. Nobles urged the king to act for the safety of the kingdom. "If the gods demand sacrifice, we cannot risk defying them," they argued. Finally, on a moonless night, the king and queen made a decision that broke their hearts. They would send the child away, offering him to the sea in the hope that the gods would show mercy. The queen prepared a cradle made of driftwood, lined with silks and fragrant flowers. She kissed her baby's forehead, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Forgive us," she whispered. "We love you more than anything in this world." The king carried the cradle to the shore. The waves glimmered faintly under the starlight, as if they already knew what was coming. Together, the king and queen set the cradle afloat, watching as it drifted into the vast ocean. As they stood on the shore, the queen sobbed and the king held her close. They prayed silently, hoping their sacrifice would protect the kingdom. Far away, the waves carried the cradle gently, cradling the baby in their cool embrace. The crescent moon mark on his chest began to glow faintly, casting a soft light on the water. The sea seemed to hum as though it had claimed the child as its own. And so, the prince was left to the mercy of the ocean, his fate unknown. The kingdom fell silent, haunted by their choice. Not far away, the calm blue waters began to ripple. From the depths of the sea, a figure slowly emerged. It was Aquata, a kind-hearted mermaid who visited the shore once every day to watch the humans from afar. Her golden hair shimmered in the sunlight, and her emerald-green tail sparkled like jewels. Aquata had watched humans her whole life. She admired them, their laughter, their songs, and their love for one another. She often stayed hidden, for her kind was forbidden to reveal themselves to the humans. But today was different. As she swam closer to the shore, Aquata heard the baby's cries. Her heart tightened. She peeked above the water and saw him, a tiny infant wrapped in fine silk, crying all alone near the entrance of the tent. The sight tugged at her soul. Why would they leave a baby all alone? She whispered to herself. Her bright blue eyes scanned the area. Where are his parents? Aquata stayed quiet for a moment, watching carefully. She saw no one near the baby. The wind blew and the baby's cries grew louder. He was cold. He was afraid. Without thinking, Aquata swam closer. "Show, little one," she whispered softly. "I will help you." She glanced back and forth, her heart pounding. What if someone saw her? What if this was wrong? But she couldn't ignore the baby's cries. She couldn't leave him there. Aquata said, "It's all right," she cooed softly. "I'm here." The baby stopped crying for a moment and looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. Aquata smiled, her heart melting. "You are so small and so precious," she said. "You do not belong here all alone. I will keep you safe," Aquata whispered. With that, Aquata carried the baby carefully in the blanket and lifted him into her arms. She looked toward the sea, her home, her safe place, and without hesitation she slid back into the water, carrying the child with her. The waves welcomed her, splashing gently as she disappeared beneath the surface. The underwater was full of light, shining through in shades of blue and gold. Coral reefs glowed in every color of the rainbow, and fish swam in sparkling schools. Aquata swam carefully, cradling the baby in her arms. The sea creatures watched curiously as she passed. A dolphin playfully twirled beside her, and a sea turtle swam closer for a better look. "Is that a human baby?" the creatures whispered to one another. When Aquata reached her underwater kingdom, she was greeted by her fellow merfolk. They stared at her in shock. "Aquata," an older mermaid cried. "What have you done? You know we cannot bring humans here." "He was alone," Aquata said firmly. "His parents abandoned him. I couldn't leave him there to cry and suffer." The older mermaid frowned but said nothing more. Aquata's kindness was well known, and no one could argue with her decision. She took the baby to her coral palace, a beautiful place filled with soft, glowing lights and flowing curtains made of seaweed. She laid him gently on a bed made of shells and covered him with a soft blanket of seagrass. The baby stared up at her, his tiny eyes wide with wonder. Aquata smiled. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered. "You are safe now. I will take care of you." Days turned into weeks. Aquata named the baby Edward, a name she had once heard from a human song. Edward grew strong and healthy under her care. The merfolk who had been unsure of him at first began to accept him. He laughed and played with the dolphins, and he loved watching the colorful fish swim by. But as Edward grew older, Aquata could not ignore the mark on the back of his neck. The strange red circle seemed to glow faintly sometimes, as though it held a secret. Aquata didn't know what it meant, but she feared it was important. "Who are you really, Edward?" she whispered one night, watching him sleep peacefully. "What is your destiny?" But deep below the sea, in a world of magic and wonder, Edward thrived under Aquata's care. And though no one knew it yet, this was only the beginning of his story. Years passed in the magical underwater kingdom, and Edward grew stronger and more curious with each passing day. The boy who had once been a helpless infant was now a tall, brave young man. His hair was as dark as the night sea, and his eyes sparkled like sunlight reflecting on the water. The merfolk adored him for he was kind, playful and full of questions about the world above. Aquata, his mermaid guardian, watched him grow with both love and concern. She had raised him like her own, teaching him the ways of the sea. Edward learned to swim alongside the dolphins, dive deep into hidden caves and understand the songs of the whales. He became faster, stronger and more graceful than any human could imagine. Yet Aquata knew that Edward was different. His heart belonged to the land. No matter how much he loved his sea family, he often stared upward at the surface of the water, lost in thought. One evening, as the golden glow of the setting sun filtered down into the sea, Edward sat on a large rock surrounded by colorful fish. Aquata swam toward him, her shimmering green tail glowing softly in the dim light. "What troubles you, Edward?" she asked gently. Edward turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Aquata, why am I different from everyone here?" Aquata's heart sank. She had known this moment would come, the moment when Edward would begin to question his origins. For years she had shielded him from the truth, hoping to protect him. But now he was older and he deserved to know. "Edward," she began softly, sitting beside him, "there is something I must tell you. It's time you learned the truth about who you are." Edward's eyes widened. "The truth?" Aquata nodded and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You are not like us because you are not from the sea. You were born on land, in a great and beautiful city of Simba Kingdom." Edward froze, his heart pounding. "Simba Kingdom? I've heard of it in the songs of the merfolk. Is that where I'm from?" Aquata nodded. "You were born with a special mark, a red circle on the back of your neck. It is no ordinary mark. The humans believed it was a bad omen, a sign of danger to come. Your parents loved you, Edward, but fear clouded their hearts." Edward's mind spun with confusion and disbelief. "But why did you take me, Aquata? Why didn't you leave me?" Aquata's eyes filled with tears. "They had abandoned you. You were alone, crying on the cold ground. I couldn't bear it. I brought you here to keep you safe, to give you a home where you would be loved." Edward looked away, his heart aching. "So, my parents are alive? They are out there somewhere?" "Yes," Aquata said softly. "They are alive and they are waiting for you, even if they don't know it yet." Edward stood up and took a deep breath. His thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. Confusion, anger, and an unexpected longing. All his life he had felt a strange emptiness, a sense that he was missing something. Now he knew why. "I have to find them," Edward said suddenly, his voice firm. "I have to see my parents. I need to know who I really am." Quada's heart sank. She had known this would happen, but she wasn't ready to let him go. "Edward, the journey to the land will not be easy. You have lived here your whole life. The land is different. It is harsh and full of challenges." "I don't care," Edward said, determination blazing in his eyes. "I need to know my roots. I need to prove to my parents who I've become." Aquata sighed and nodded slowly. "I understand, Edward. It will not stop you. But promise me something." "What?" Edward asked. "Promise me you will be careful," Aquata said, her voice trembling. "And promise me you will return to the sea whenever you need me. I will always be here for you." Edward smiled faintly. "I promise, Aquata. I will never forget you. You are my family too." That night, the underwater kingdom buzzed with whispers of Edward's decision. The sea creatures who had watched him grow gathered to say goodbye. The dolphins leapt playfully, the turtles swam in slow circles, and even the jellyfish glowed softly as though lighting his path. Aquata gave Edward a special necklace made from a shimmering pearl. "This will remind you of the sea and of me," she said. "And it will give you strength when you need it most." The next morning, Edward stood at the edge of the shore where the ocean met the land. His heart raced with excitement and fear as he looked at the sand beneath his feet. For the first time he would leave the sea, the only home he had ever known. Aquata swam close to him, her eyes shining with tears. "I believe in you, Edward," she said softly. "You are strong and brave, and I know you will find what you are looking for." Edward bent down and hugged her tightly. "Thank you, Aquata. I will make you proud." With that, Edward took a deep breath, turned toward the land and began his journey. His feet sank into the warm sand and the sound of the waves grew fainter behind him. Aquata watched until he disappeared from view, her heart aching. "Goodbye, my son," she whispered, tears falling into the sea. "May the gods protect you." Edward's journey to the Simba Kingdom was long and full of challenges. The forests were dense and the mountains were steep. But Edward pressed on, determined to find his parents. He carried Aquata's necklace close to his heart and thought of her often, drawing strength from her love. Along the way, Edward met people and travelers who spoke of the city of Simba Kingdom's wealth and beauty. But he also heard whispers of sadness. The lost prince who had disappeared many years ago, leaving the kingdom in mourning. Edward, out of ignorance, looked and greeted them and continued his journey. After days of travel, Edward stood at the top of a hill overlooking the grand city of Simba Kingdom. The palace walls rose high into the sky, and the city sparkled with diamonds. It was more beautiful than he had ever imagined. Edward took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "I'm coming home." Thinking if he could get to the palace and explain himself to the king, he will get to know of his parents if they are still alive. The sun rose high in the sky, casting its golden light across the Simba Kingdom. The grand city sparkled with diamonds, the rooftops of its houses gleaming like stars under the bright sun. Merchants crowded the market squares, children played in the streets, and the air buzzed with laughter and cheer. But at the heart of the city, in the royal palace, a quiet sadness lingered. Though the kingdom thrived, King Marcus and Queen Leona still carried a hidden grief, the loss of their son, the prince who had vanished 2 decades ago. Edward stood at the city gates, his heart pounding as he took in the sight before him. He had finally arrived. The Simba Kingdom, the place of his birth, stretched out before him in all its beauty. For a moment he simply stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I made it," he whispered to himself, clutching Aquata's pearl necklace that hung around his neck. "I'm here." He was no longer a helpless baby, he was a strong and brave young man, but he still needed a plan to get to meet his parents. Edward, walking through the kingdom and watching its people. The streets were filled with life. Merchants selling colorful fabrics and sweet-smelling fruits, blacksmiths shaping swords and roaring fires, and children running through the alleys, their laughter filling the air. Yet as Edward walked, he noticed something strange. In the quiet corners of the city, people spoke in whispers. He stopped near a small group of people who were huddled together, their faces worried. "It's getting worse," one man said. "The crops in the eastern fields are dying." "And the river?" another asked. "It's drying up faster than we've ever seen. If it continues, we'll have no water left." Edward listened closely, his brow furrowed. "What's happening to the kingdom?" he thought. "Why are the fields and rivers suffering in such a rich land?" He remembered the mark on his neck, the red circle that his parents had feared. Could this be connected? He wondered. A new sense of purpose filled him. He had not only come to find his parents. Walking and asking for the direction to the palace. That night Edward made his way toward the palace. The grand gates towered high above him, guarded by armored soldiers holding sharp spears. Edward's heart raced. How could he get inside? "I'll have to be bold," he whispered to himself. Taking a deep breath, Edward stepped out of the shadows and approached the guards. "Halt," one of them shouted, pointing his spear at Edward. "Who are you and what business do you have here?" Edward stood tall, his voice steady. "I need to speak with the king and queen. It's urgent." The guards exchanged glances before laughing. "And why would we let a stranger speak to the king and queen?" Edward's gaze was unwavering. "Because I am not just a stranger. I am a son of the soil," and after much arguments he was let in. Getting into the palace, Edward was asked to wait. He waited until the king was told that a stranger is at the chamber waiting for him. The wondered, who could that be? The king came out and saw Edward and asked him what he wanted. Moments later, Edward humbly knelt down to greet the king, with Queen Leona, and he explained to the king about his journey to the city of Simba Kingdom in search of his parents, to know about his origin. "I was born here. My parent abandoned me by the seashore. I have a birthmark on me, hoping it will make my parents identify me." Hearing this, the king, out of shock, rose to his feet, his eyes narrowing. "Prove it," he said. "Show me the mark." Edward turned and pulled down the collar of his shirt, revealing the glowing red circle on the back of his neck. The queen gasped, tears spilling down her cheeks. The king's face paled as he took a shaky step forward. "It's him," Queen Leona whispered. "By king, it's really him." King Marcus stared at Edward, his eyes full of disbelief and wonder. "My son," he said, his voice cracking. "You're alive." The queen ran to Edward, wrapping her arms around him as she wept. My son, I thought we had lost you forever. Edward, surprised, hugged her tightly, tears streaming down his own face. I'm here, mother. I've come back. King Marcus approached slowly, his voice heavy with emotion. Where have you been? How did you survive all these years? Edward looked at them both, his heart full of love and sadness. I was saved, he said softly. I was raised in the sea by someone who loved me like her own. A mermaid named Aquata found me and cared for me. She gave me a home when I had none. The king and queen listened in awe, their hearts breaking and healing all at once. As the family reunited, news spread quickly throughout the palace and the kingdom. The lost prince had returned. The people of Simba Kingdom gathered outside the palace gates, cheering and crying tears of joy. Bells rang out across the city, and the air was filled with celebration. But Edward knew that his journey was far from over. The kingdom was still suffering and the mark on his neck still carried its mystery. As he stood on the palace balcony looking out at the cheering crowd, he turned to his parents and said, I have returned not just to find you, but to save this kingdom. I know the mark on my neck is important. It holds a secret and I intend to uncover it. King Marcus looked at his son with pride. You're brave, Edward. We will stand with you. Edward nodded, his eyes blazing with determination. I will not fail you. I will save this kingdom. Far away, deep in the sea, Aquata smiled as she gazed toward the shore. You are strong, Edward, she whispered. Your destiny has only just begun. The grand celebration in Simba Kingdom continued into the night. But for Prince Edward, the weight of his return pressed heavily on his shoulders. Reuniting with his parents was a joy he could never have imagined, yet his thoughts were always drawn to the mystery of the red mark on his neck. The mark that had caused him to be abandoned, the mark that now seemed to hold the key to the kingdom's suffering. The next morning, after the excitement had died down, Edward stood by the palace window, gazing out at the city. The streets, which had been filled with life the previous night, now seemed quieter, as if something still lingered in the air, a sense of unease. Edward could feel it too. The crops were failing, the river was drying up, and something deep within the land felt wrong. Father, Edward said, turning toward King Marcus, who sat at the grand table, reading through reports from the kingdom's officials. I need to speak with you. I believe the troubles of the kingdom are connected to my mark. There's something I must discover about it. The king looked up, his face filled with both pride and worry. Edward, my son, you have already proven your strength. But if what you say is true, we must know how to stop this curse before it destroys our people. Queen Liana, who had been quietly sitting nearby, joined them at the table. What do you think we should do, Edward? How can we uncover the truth? Edward paused, thinking carefully. The only way to understand the mark is to find someone who knows about its origins. There is a place, an ancient temple, deep in the forests of the east. I've heard of it in the stories of the villagers. They say it holds secrets that no one has dared to uncover in generations. I believe it may hold the answers. The king nodded slowly. I've heard of the temple. It is said to be protected by powerful magic. Few who have ventured there have returned. Then it is settled, Edward said. I will go. I must find out what this mark means and how it is connected to the land's suffering. Only then can I save this kingdom. The journey to the ancient temple was treacherous. Edward traveled with a small group of trusted guards, cutting through dense forests and climbing steep hills. As they ventured deeper into the wild, the air grew heavy and strange sounds echoed through the trees. Birds flew overhead, their wings silent, as if they too were waiting for something to happen. Edward's heart raced with each step. The further they traveled, the more the mark on his neck seemed to burn, a gentle heat that pulsed as if it had a life of its own. He knew this was no ordinary mark. It was a sign, a symbol of something ancient and powerful. Finally, after days of travel, they reached the temple. The stone structure stood tall and imposing, covered in ivy and moss. The air around it was thick with magic, and Edward could feel the pull of something deep within the earth. The doors of the temple were heavy, carved with intricate symbols and runes that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. As Edward approached the entrance, he felt a sudden chill. He turned to his guards. Stay here, he said. This is something I must do alone. With a deep breath, Edward pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The interior was dark, with only faint light filtering through cracks in the stone. As his eyes adjusted, he saw walls lined with ancient carvings, stories of a long-lost civilization etched into the stone. At the far end of the temple a pedestal stood, and on it rested a glowing crystal. Edward knew instinctively that this was the heart of the temple, the source of its power. He walked toward it, the heat from his mark growing stronger with each step. When he reached the pedestal he placed his hand on the crystal, and in that moment the room seemed to come alive. The walls trembled and a deep voice echoed in the chamber. "Who dares to disturb the sacred temple?" Edward stood tall, his voice steady. "I am Prince Edward of Simba Kingdom. I seek the truth of the mark on my neck and its connection to the land's suffering. Tell me what I must do to save my kingdom." The voice replied, "You bear the mark of the Chosen One. It is the mark of the sea and the land, the balance between both worlds." Edward's heart skipped a beat. "The Chosen One," he whispered. "Yes," the voice continued. "The mark was placed upon you at birth, a symbol of the pact made between the sea and the land. The kingdom flourished because of this balance. But the pact was broken when the prince was abandoned. The land has begun to wither as a result, and only the return of the Chosen One can restore it." Edward's mind spun as the weight of the words sank in. "But why was I abandoned? Why did my parents fear the mark?" The mark was seen as a curse, but it was never meant to harm. The fear of the unknown caused the kingdom to turn its back on its own future. Now you must restore the balance. To do so you must unite the sea and the land. The key lies within the waters where the great pearl is kept. Bring it to the heart of the kingdom and the land will heal. Edward's eyes widened. The great pearl. The pearl is a gift from the sea, a token of the eternal bond between the two realms. Only the Chosen One can retrieve it. Edward stood in silence, his mind racing. "But how do I find the great pearl?" The voice responded, "You already know the way. Follow your heart and the path will reveal itself. Trust in the sea, trust in yourself." Edward left the temple with a new sense of purpose. He knew what he had to do now. The great pearl was the key to restoring the kingdom, and he had to find it before it was too late. As he traveled back to the shore he thought of Aquata. She had been his protector, his guide, and now he would need her help to retrieve the pearl. He could feel the ocean calling to him, urging him to return. When he arrived at the shore he knelt by the water, calling out to Aquata. "Aquata, I need your help. The great pearl, it's the key to saving the kingdom. I must find it. Will you guide me?" The waves gently lapped at the shore, and then from beneath the surface Aquata appeared, her green tail shimmering in the sunlight. "I've been waiting this day, Edward," she said softly. Together they dove into the ocean's depths. The water was cool and clear, the light from above casting a magical glow over everything. As they swam deeper the pressure increased, but Edward felt strong, stronger than ever before. Finally, in a hidden cave at the ocean's deepest point, they found the great pearl. It glowed with a soft, radiant light, pulsing with energy. Edward reached out and gently took it into his hands, feeling its warmth fill him with power. As he swam back to the surface he knew his mission was almost complete. With the great pearl in his possession, the kingdom's fate was in his hands. Edward returned to Simba Kingdom with the pearl, and as he placed it at the heart of the kingdom, a powerful light erupted from the ground, spreading across the land. The crops began to flourish once more, the rivers flowed with fresh water and the skies cleared. The balance between the sea and the land had been restored. King Marcus and Queen Leona watched in awe as their son, the Chosen One, fulfilled his destiny. The kingdom was saved, and with it, Edward's place in history was secured. But for Edward, the journey was not just about saving a kingdom. It was about understanding who he was, reconnecting with his roots, and finding the love that had always been there, waiting for him. Edward stood on the palace balcony, looking out over the city of the kingdom he had saved. "You did it," the king said softly. "You have become the prince you were always meant to be." Edward smiled, his heart full. The bond between the sea and the land would never be broken again. And so, the story of Prince Edward, the lost prince who became a hero, was told for generations to come.